As the Las Plagas were discovered, with apparently saying, Las Plagas or the Las Plagas is like saying the Plagas, I'm still going to say ATM machine as well, their initial utilization was really just more of an infection in terms of usefulness. By using a dominant strain of this parasite, all subsequent downstream infected people could be controlled and tracked rather easily through their biological programming. Pushing those who were infected to view the parasite as almost a holy relic, a cult could be launched shortly after, with most of the village and nobility in the area being infected. A man by the name of Osmond Sadler had a plan to catch this big president man's daughter in order to begin to infect the planet. With home base secured, he would inject the parasite into the president's daughter, who Sadler would then control. The idea from here was simple. Use the daughter to obviously get close with her father and then inject him with the parasite. With the leader of the free world infected, from here it was pretty simple. Infect the team associated with the president, other leaders at meetings, and so on and so forth until you had the upper echelons of leadership in the world compromised, and then the rest of the human race would follow soon after. This would leave Sadler as the undisputed world leader of a species whose heads explode at night due to the parasite growth in their bodies. And if you don't believe that actually happens, remember, even before these things saw Leon, their heads still exploded in parasites. However, it would become apparent that there would be resistance to this, obviously, as not everybody would be infected at once. With outward presentations of the infection, it would not be long before clearly organizations would begin to take notice of any infected individuals, and a pushback would begin. And because of that, experimentations would need to be done over the ensuing years. These experimentations would result in horrific mutations intentionally induced that would probably, violate some sort of medical ethics. But nobody said Sadler was a guy who likes to not create wretched abominations. So as a result, many variants of these creatures would begin to crop up. It began simply enough: a human body combined with several Las Plagas to create a creature capable of regenerating lost body parts, such as the Regenerator. A larger parasite added to the cervical area of the spine, interacting with the lower portion of the brain to create El Gigante from essentially hormone overgrowth. And even a giant salamander in the lake that is just a giant salamander riddled with parasites from the bodies it eats that appear to have failed the infection vibe check. But as the test continued on the local populace, they would begin to get more extreme. Ramon Salazar's own personal groupies would begin to get involved in the experimentation process. Outlined in the Chronicles of Pursuit, we get an idea of what was going on since the parasite's discovery and experimentation process began. October, 8 years since my awakening. At last, my noble pursuit progresses to its final stage, the fusion of human and insect. The housekeeper has graciously volunteered herself for the experiment. I break in to say, volunteer? Probably voluntold. I shall pour my whole heart into this endeavor in order to transcend humanity and make Master Ramon proud. March, 9 years since my awakening. A glorious union has been made. The housekeeper has endured much suffering, but not for naught. Behold the fruits of my labor in all its beauty. I shall consecrate this perfect life form with the name U3, for 3 is the most beautiful and complete number. April, 9 years since my awakening. U3, my dear hound Pesanta, has been chosen to serve as the right hand of Master Ramon, but is 2 not better than 1. Now it is my turn to demonstrate my loyalty. His humble servant, Isidro Urati Talavera. Pretty sure that's not how you say any of that, but as the experimentations continued, approaching near a decade, the gene splicing ability of the Las Plagas possessed would begin to be explored to its ultimate end, possessing the T-virus within their bodies. And yes, that is actual lore. The Las Plagas are infected with the T-virus. This gave this parasite the ability to alter genomes that they came across, which in turn would induce mutations that would increase its chances of surviving in a hostile environment. But there was another side to this ability, which also, if you would like to learn about the T-virus, I have done a video on it a while back during the Resident Evil 2 remake era. Man, that seems like it was forever ago. But as the Las Plagas settles into the human body more deeply, if other genomes are given a chance to inspire some interesting results within the body, it will absolutely use that. The Verdugo are a perfect example of this. The Verdugo are the right and left hand of Salazar Ramon, with one of those being the U3. Being the housekeeper and the scientists who conducted these actual experiments, they would do the bidding of the nobleman, which usually meant taking out anyone who got kind of in the way or got involved when they weren't supposed to. As Leon is dispatched, he ends up taking out one of the Verdugo that was clearly a combination of man and insect, which I believe was Isidro, and another more horrific variant was created out of the unnamed housekeeper, who would ultimately become known as Pesanta. Leon would never have the misfortune of running into U3, at least in the remake, because in the original he does, but Ada would ultimately become entangled in a long-running battle with the Verdugo that at first would go on to infect her through a parasite-laced dart, before showing its true form in a final confrontation that straight up activates my almonds. You see, in the immortalized words of Damon Baird, humans are hardwired to react to things that skitter, and brother, I hate things that skitter. So I believe the first place we should start is the initial interactions and what they tell us about this creature's ability before moving on to its physiology, because the inspired mutations are quite extensive. Beginning with the parasitic dart, this is nothing more than what we've seen before in any of the other infected. This would imply that within this clearly biotic dart, it's housing a parasite embryo that makes its way into Ada. What I find most interesting, however, is how the Verdugo goes on to actually utilize this parasite and its effects on the brain. Once infected, this specific Verdugo appears to have a range of effect on Ada, and this would imply that the parasite appears to have a frequency in which they communicate with one another. As it continually is able to track her, this would induce other effects internally. One of the major abilities of the parasite is its ability to induce hallucinations. Hallucinations in a lot of ways are probably not what you think they are. For instance, a lot of people assume it has to be an overactivation of neuronal tissue. But is this right? No. The reality is based on the visual hallucinations and the auditory variants intended to confuse Ada and protect the Verdugo, and this would involve a lot of areas like the occipital and temporoparietal areas of the brain, but it does not involve potential overactivation. Now, typically, once again, the thinking with this is that the brain would almost have to be having like a seizure to create these images. In a lot of ways, it's actually a decrease in activity that creates hallucinations. Take my migraines, for instance. When I get visual auras, it starts as a blind spot in my vision. The brain is no longer receiving information, so it is making it up as it goes along, and that's what I see. How I know it's a blind spot is because, let's say, I was looking at, like, my wife the other day, right? And I looked at her face, and while I could see the vague color of her face, and I know she was there, I cannot make out any fine details. Like, looking at her face, it'll be gone. But the skin color is there. However, looking directly at it, I can't see it, but I can see skin color that's trying to fill in. Basically, she looks like Slender Man. So it's very interesting and annoying because that means I'm about to have a great time with pain in the brain. But this lack of information being filled in to create essentially a hallucination, because my brain is quite literally making up what it thinks it's there, therefore I'm hallucinating it, I'm not taking in that information. And this typically involves irritation in my occipital lobe, and from what I can gather, it's related to nitrates, which dilate my blood vessels. And now these are pretty simple hallucinations, probably relegated to the Brodmann areas 17 of the primary visual cortex, which is associated with simple visual hallucinations. However, with Ada, this would be an entirely different experience based on the fact that the entire Verdugo is there. In fact, multiple of them are, and for her to visually hallucinate several of these things, this would require way more precise control. With the parasite in her body, it's clear this hallucination is likely being induced through hormonal control more than anything, as the parasite would not have any time to reach its tendrils into her head as of yet. Irritation in the Brodmann areas 18 and 19 can induce what are known as complex visual hallucinations, which is exactly what the Verdugo is doing. These hallucinations create copies of itself and make an area appear foggy with smoke. This complex activation of pathways would induce massive irritation in the visual cortex, and the reason they are even the Verdugo itself is because the Verdugo is close and in her line of sight, so the brain hallucinates more at that point. It's sort of like why my brain takes information that's happening around it and then fills it in when I kind of have a simple hallucination from like a migraine or something. The brain sees it, so it's like, oh, there must be more, and it's basically just, I guess, pattern activation that creates the issue, or pattern deactivation, I suppose, because really, I mean, the cortex is irritated at this point, so to create hallucinations, it's usually a decrease in activity. But this also explains why Ada keeps grabbing her head, as she's literally potentially having a migraine attack every single time she's fighting these things, which is just an absolute blast, as I imagine. So after the first fight with this creature, as she is officially infected, the growth of the parasite would progress, as with all others, in a very similar manner. However, as Ada continues through on her mission, it's clear that the parasite growing is not only beginning to exhibit many of the same symptoms as everyone else, such as cranial pain, black blood vessels, and momentary loss of control, but she is also able to be tracked by the U3 rather easily. As she injects the suppressant into her body, this immediately quells the embryonic parasite's ability to communicate, resulting in the Verdugo losing track of her. But this is a temporary solution, as soon enough it begins tracking her once more, leading to the final confrontation. The U3, or Pesanta as it's known, will enter its final confrontation with Ada within the cave system after departing from Ramon. descending into the area that is most definitely not an arena of sorts, the creature will shed its robe, which shows that it's actually a 1 out of 10 in terms of human forms, but an 11 out of 10 in terms of, good God, what is that thing? The extensiveness of the mutations this creature possesses are beyond measure. As we look at it actively transforming, it's not so much that a human that was there possesses the knowledge to change, but instead the U3 mutations are driven by the Las Plagas, which we will see momentarily. Essentially being a puppet like all others, this is taken to its ultimate conclusion concerning this beast. So we all know where we have to start, at least the alpha chads who've watched for a while. So as is with tradition, we stand on business with this channel. Starting with the feet, we see several interesting things. First, there is nothing human left about it structurally, really, if you take a good look. We know the U3 is a combination of human and Novistador genetics, and this has resulted in the elongated foot with 2 sharp forward claws on the front and a claw jutting out from the side, which is interesting, as this is where perhaps mammalian genetics come into play with a dew claw of sorts, but this is much more likely just based on human genetics, so it would be like a big toe. A claw on each foot coming out of the heel can be seen as well. As we move up the leg, we see the knees are still in their human form, but because of the elongation of the tarsal bones, the leg structuring has turned into digitigrade, and this would very likely come from humans. As we move up to the thigh region, thick thighs save lives, as the muscle in this area must support the massive amount of weight, because we know Ada is around like 5 feet 7 inches or 170 centimeters. This creature is easily 15 to 18 feet tall, which means this thing is probably at least over like 1 to 2 tons. So this indicates like the weight that it must hold up. Being like that, it's gonna be difficult, and then we haven't even talked about the growth on its back. Moving up to the pelvic region, we see nothing is really there. However, the abdominal region still has remnants of the muscle from its original form. This new muscle, however, helps to serve as an anchor for the monstrosity that we are moving to now. I had a tough time debating on which to cover first, like the head or the tail, but the tail of the U3 attaches itself likely to the sacral area of the spine, which is actually at the base of the lumbar, with muscle wrapped around the front to hold it steady. This continuation of the spine is a combination of growth from the human body and the Las Plagas. The parasite has had more than enough time to fully fuse with the body of the housekeeper, and as a result, it can operate much like a new limb. Likely measuring about 15 feet in length, given it's the same size as the housekeeper, it's a grotesque amalgamation of muscle and bone, segmented much like a centipede. And like a centipede, the face opens up into a spiked mouth with several bony teeth, not unlike the abomination known as an anglerfish, but these teeth likely hail from human genetics because the Novistadors do not appear to have teeth. Moving back to the housekeeper, as we move up to the chest region, we can see the skin and appearance of the thoracic area is mostly human, with the same anatomical connections we would expect to see on anyone else. In fact, it is very similar to the other Verdugo, which is why I also believe that there are added genetics into this specific variant of Verdugo, allowing for it to present like it is, seeing as the other Verdugo does not have the same characteristics as U3. Moving down the arms, we see the humerus area with the biceps and triceps are in pretty much the same proportion as we would expect on a human with one another, as well as the anterior deltoids of the shoulder. However, as we move down to the forearm, the musculature grows considerably in order to allow for the creature to operate its 3-fingered claws. These claws are also seen on the Verdugo in the same capacity of the other Verdugo, clearly hailing from the Novistadors. So as we move back up to the head, we see some interesting morphological alterations. While appearing overall human-esque, the face is only half there, with the lower half being an open mass of tentacles. These tentacles in the Verdugo form have the ability to pierce the skin of Ada and seemingly drain her body of her blood, leaving her like a husk as a result. The trapezius muscles have grown in size, and likely this is bunching up near the back of its head, and it has more to do with the parasite in this area having tendrils there, as they have run into the brain as well. And speaking of the upper portion of the head, the eyes are still there along with the skin. In fact, they have the same glowing that most of the other infected have, and the nose appears to be missing, but on top of the head, the skull has been split. As it makes reference in the notes to her suffering, it is entirely possible that the skull had to be removed in this area as the brain grew or was pushed up by the parasite. Interestingly, along with the ridge of the skull, we can see that there is some sort of chitinous growth running right down the middle. This may also be why the skull is missing, as this growth inside the brain area at first could have threatened the project if the housekeeper expired, so accommodations were made to her actual skull. It's important to remember that this creature is essentially 2 consciousness in one. The parasite has grown to the point where it is now aware and able to act independent of the host. However, at first it will pilot the host, but it appears as though, based on what's been said in lore, the host is still consciously in there. They just now appear completely indoctrinated by the parasite, so they agree with basically everything and act accordingly. So while there's two minds operating, it's really kind of like a minor mind and then like what's really in control. But in the case of fighting the U3, when it does find you, it has the ability to fire explosive sacks at you that can injure you. This comes from the tail section, and considering it is anchored on the lower part of the body, it has likely mutagenically grown the stomach tissue to utilize the proton pump ability to create more acid. Couple that with mucus, and you now have the ability to create these acid balls that blow up and are really annoying because Ada handles like a concrete fridge sometimes. But as you fight it and injure it, eventually, what seems to be likely due to the fact that the housekeeper form has taken enough damage, this will result in the Las Plagas centipede to form an abandoned ship to begin its own personal attack. Much like the third parasitic form, which is, the regulars who are not infected with the chimera, this version will run around trying to injure you, which unfortunately it's pretty good at. However, overcoming this and injuring it enough times, this will result in the end of the parasite as well. And I can hear you asking though, what happens if you stand there and let it take you out because you have morbid curiosity? Honestly, I hate to be this guy, but compared to the original version that would literally bite your upper half off at the collarbone, the tail will just kind of bite Ada's neck, piercing her jugular and carotid, inducing massive blood loss, leading to a bleed out in just like a few moments. It's honestly very mid. Overcoming the U3, which should have been what you were doing all along, it's clear that while the Verdugo appears to be subservient to Ramon and thus Sadler, they are their own dominant strain in some capacity. Upon the parasite's expiration and losing in structural guidance from the dominant strain of U3, it will immediately have its jimmies rustled inside of Ada to the point that it will force its way out of her body. Ada will then crush it, ending her infection in the process. The U3, in my humble biological opinion, is someone who got totally screwed. Appearing like a Verdugo initially, under times of extreme stress or the need to anatomically adapt, it was capable of becoming an entire chimeric monster, which then could bite your neck so deep that you basically would look like a half-eaten apple. However, there's one thing it didn't count on, and that's me replacing every cell in its body with lead. Remember, at the end of the day, you're simply a biological chemical reaction. If you disrupt the chemical reaction, well, that's the end of that. But anyhow, I want to hear what you guys think. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm not sure if this seemed like it was all over the place, but I've got several life-altering events coming down the pipeline all at once currently, so to say I'm a little scattered is a massive understatement. Mentally, I am taxed to maximum. So if you enjoyed, please leave a like as it gets the video out there, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my merch, Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and link to Roanoke Tales, where last week, we're talking about something I can't even honestly remember. Anyways, speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astrophysicist, Des Dancer. Thank you, bro. Next up, our scientists, Chad the Enjoyer of Scientific Explanations of B-grade horror movies, Dakota23, Florian Lucian Dragon, Octavia, Serpentia, and the last final girl on the left. Thank you guys as well. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you. Your help goes a long way towards keeping this channel up and running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.